Okay, continue on in our discussion of the FASB ASC's Topic 958, not-for-profit entities. For this video and the next little series, we're going to be talking about financially interrelated entities as it relates to this not-for-profit entity subtopic. And so for this first video, let's first understand exactly what is a financially interrelated entity and how it applies to this particular topic. So first we see that the entities have to be not-for-profit entities, as was described in 958.10.15. But now they're adding a few other stipulations within the scope to apply as a financially interrelated entity. And so first it says that a recipient entity and a specified beneficiary are financially interrelated entities. The relationship between them has both of the following characteristics. So let's first understand what's a recipient entity. We see here that a recipient entity is a not-for-profit entity or a charitable trust that accepts assets from a donor or other resource provider and agrees to use those assets on behalf of or transfer those assets, the return on investment of those assets, or both to a beneficiary that is specified by the donor or resource provider. So if the not-for-profit entity receives, we'll say $100,000 from a donor, but the donor says that, hey, you need to send that $100,000 to a different entity, then they're saying that that entity that gets the $100,000 first is the recipient entity, and then the entity that gets the $100,000 in the end is the beneficiary. So let's go back to the scope section now that we have an understanding of what a recipient entity is. So basically this recipient entity is just a pass-through of the funds to the specified beneficiary. And so this recipient entity and the specified beneficiary are financially interrelated if they have the following characteristics. So let's look at this definition here for financially interrelated entities. And we see that the same sentence as what we were seeing before. Recipient entity, the pass-through entity, and a specified beneficiary, the entity that gets the funds in the end, are financially interrelated entities that the relationship between them has both of the following characteristics. So first, one of the entities has the ability to influence the operating and financial decisions of the other, and one of the entities has an ongoing economic interest in the net assets of the other. And so if we go back to the scope section, we dive deeper into each of these characteristics. But for now, we see that the recipient and the specified beneficiary have to have both of these characteristics in place for it to be a financially interrelated entity. Let's go back here to the scope section. And we see here the relationship between them has to have both of the following characteristics. And these are the same as from the definition, where one entity has the ability to influence operating and financial decisions of the other, and one entity has an ongoing economic interest in the net assets of the other. So let's take on this first characteristic first. So this ability to exercise the influence on the other entity could be demonstrated in several ways. First of all, the entities could be affiliates. One entity could have considerable representation on the governing board of the other entity. So maybe the board of directors for both entities is the same. The charter or bylaws of one entity limits its activities to those that are beneficial to the other entity. So maybe this recipient entity, their operations are forced or limited to just being a pass-through entity. So that entity's activities are limited to being beneficial to the beneficiary. And finally, an agreement between the entities allows one entity to actively participate in policy-making processes of the other, such as setting organizational priorities, budgets, and management compensation. So these might all be examples of ways that one entity has the ability to influence operating and financial decisions of the other. First, before we go to this one, let's check the definition of an affiliate, just so we understand another way that they might qualify as interrelated entities. And so an affiliate is a party that directly or indirectly, through one or more intermediaries, is controlled by or is under common control with an entity. So this definition sort of follows along with the other ways that the entity has the ability to influence the operating and financial decisions of the other. So one entity can control the other, or these entities are controlled by a common entity. And so, as we saw, both of these characteristics have to be in place in order for them to be financially interrelated entities. So let's take a look at the second consideration. It is that one entity has an ongoing economic interest in the net assets of the other. So let's see what an ongoing economic interest means. We see here that this entity has a residual right to another not-for-profit entity's net assets that results from an ongoing relationship. So, and the value of those rights increases or decreases as a result of the investment, fundraising, operating, and other activities of the entity. So an example of that might be that if the recipient entity is merely a pass-through of funds to the beneficiary, then the beneficiary's rights increase or decrease as a result of the recipient entity's fundraising or operating or other activities. So in that case, the beneficiary would have an economic interest in the net assets of the recipient entity. So let's go back here where they explain a little bit further about the ongoing economic interest in the net assets of the other. And here they basically just repeat the definition that ongoing economic interest in the net assets of the recipient entity. The beneficiary has rights to the assets held by the recipient entity are residual rights, and that means that the value of those rights increases or decreases as a result of investment, fundraising, operating, and other activities of the recipient entity. So, as we said, if the recipient entity gets more assets or more donations, then the beneficiary entity would get more also. If this recipient entity is clearly a pass-through specifically for this beneficiary. And it could also be the other way around, although it's a bit less common, where the recipient entity may have an ongoing economic interest in the net assets of the specified beneficiary. This almost seems a little backwards because, by definition, the recipient entity gets the funds first and sends them to the beneficiary. But I guess in some cases that could happen. And so in that case, they would have residual rights and the value changes as a result of the operations of the beneficiary. And so then they would meet this particular requirement. So as we saw, in order for the entities to be financially interrelated, the recipient and the beneficiary need to have these two characteristics in place. And that is that one entity influences the other's financial decisions and operations, and that one entity has an ongoing economic interest in the net assets of the other. And further, the entity has to be a nonprofit, as we saw here in the overall scope section. So that covers what types of entities are have to comply with this particular section. But in the next video, we'll talk about what types of transactions have to comply with this section.